Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
We left off, I think that was the last one, non-religious family, is that correct? And did we cover it?
We talked about it.
Okay, we talked about it a little bit. Jewishness as an individual matter. Non-religious family knows they're Jewish, is proud of that fact, wants to incorporate that into their lives, but they are not going to be committed to following the laws. They're not going to be observant, orthodox. The majority of Jewish people are not orthodox, but to emphasize, they are strongly identified as Jews. And so success in that kind of family, parents send their kids want to go to college. They're not going to be, they're interested in college to pursue a career. Career fulfillment is really important, high on the list. Less on the list will be, are you affiliated with the synagogue? Are you interested in, quote, spiritual things? As they relate to family, certainly important, but that's not going to be a focal point in the family's life. In a more liberal family, roles are not going to be stressed as they are in an observant family. And so you'll hear in non-religious Jewish families, they will tend to be pro-women's rights. They would tend to be pro-choice. They would tend to be women can do whatever job any man could do, including in their synagogues, if they go. And many liberal Jews are affiliated with liberal or Reformed synagogues, and we'll be talking about that shortly. But so rabbis will be female. Cantors, we'll talk about those roles, but they'll be females. And there'll be less stress on the law and more stress on incorporating current issues into the worship system, if you will. Okay. Where in a religious family, Jewish family, the families will tend to be larger. It is not common, I would say, but it's certainly not uncommon, even for families, husbands, wives, they get married, but they choose not to have children. We call them yuppies, call them whatever you want to label them. The idea of just enjoying your life, not having to worry about expenses and those kinds of things, and being able to live your life and fulfillment of your job, and also being able to accomplish things that might interest you anytime you want to do them. Marriage is important, but not for religious reasons necessarily. So you'll find that non-religious families will have a higher incidence of couples living together and then choosing marriage later. For those of you who are familiar with the Seinfeld, it's an older program, it's around a number of years, that kind of mentality, very Jewish. Seinfeld, of course, himself Jewish, many of the actors. That's kind of the upscale lifestyle that many non-traditional Jewish people would like to have. But remember, their parents would be of the age where it's a little more important to be married, and so there's pressures that result from that. Divorce. I think we spoke about this yesterday. A get has to be received by a council and approved. So in order to remarry, you must have that get, that document. So civil divorce is legally recognized, And certainly you could get a divorce through a court, and move on to another person if you want. But if you're at all interested in your Jewish, in getting married in a Jewish setting, then you have to have the get. The Bet Din is the religious court that approves the divorce. It's a ruling group of men. Again, this would be an Orthodox setting, because liberal Jewish people wouldn't tend to want or need a get, but the more observant you are, the more desirous you would be to have that in order to remarry. Death. Two important principles when there's a death in a Jewish family. First, there needs to be an honor and a respect for that body, that lifeless person. There is a handling of the body as though the person were alive. So there needs to be respect for that person and a deep concern for those who are left behind. Those are two very important principles as far as when a death occurs. Preparing for burial, men and women wear the same thing. A simple white shroud will be placed over. In the men's case, sometimes there might be a talit, which is a prayer shawl. I'll be showing you pictures of that. Might have a yarmulke on his head, again for a male. But the idea is from dust to dust, we're all equal in death. And so there isn't the idea of burying people with lots of things from the earth or their possessions. Certainly up to the couple to do that. I mean, it's up to the family to do that if they want. In most places, funeral homes will do what you want, but the law says that it should be simple, very simple. So wearing of the prayer shawl, no burial on Shabbat, but otherwise, from the time the person dies, you have 24 hours to bury that person. The reason is that there is no embalming at all. Usually there's no autopsies. There'll be an autopsy allowed by Jewish law if it will save another person's life or if there was a crime committed and the need for justice to prevail. So certainly they'll do that. Otherwise, the idea is dust to dust. Don't put any foreign substances in the body. That's where the respect comes in. Just cover the body and then bury as soon as possible. How many of you have been to a funeral before? A Christian funeral, right? Okay. Does somebody want to describe for me what a typical, in your mind, funeral would look like? Yes?
The night before, they probably have a visitation.
Visitation the night before. Mm-hmm.
And then the next morning, they probably have a funeral, but for an hour, they have an open casket.
Okay, so there would be a viewing. Maybe the night before, an open casket for people to visit, then the next day for the funeral. Might still be open before there's a service. Okay? Anybody else? Very typical to have a open casket. Very foreign to the Jewish experience. I know from my experience, I had gone to several Jewish funerals in my own family growing up. The casket was closed, not opened at all. The reason is the rabbi's desire for that person to be remembered in life, not in death. The idea of the last, now there's different schools of thought, I realize that. Some people emotionally, Jewish or not, have this emotional desire or need to say goodbye. That's permitted by the individual family where they could go to the funeral home and just say the night before or whatever, I would like to spend some time. But it's not a casket that's going to be open. In fact, it can't be open because a casket, I probably didn't write it there, But a Jewish casket cannot have any metal at all, no hinges. So in a Gentile funeral, oftentimes the casket is designed to open, to sit open so that people can walk by. Well, there can be no metal whatsoever. Everything has to decompose from dust to dust. So a Jewish funeral will have the casket with wooden pegs that are nailed in before the actual service takes place. And so if you did desire to, on your own, before the service, have time with that person, it would be with the complete lid of the casket off, because those wooden pegs would have to be there. It all has to be made of natural substance, wood, to decompose. So no autopsies as well. Now, it was funny in the film, when those of you who saw the film, trying to write the script and find a funeral at the time that we needed to do it, that actually was a Jewish funeral. The man who passed away was Jewish. He had some family who were not Jewish. And so just as I'm talking about no flowers, if any of you notice that, I'm saying, oh, there's no flowers. It coincided with there were flowers. The problem is, or the situation from a Jewish point of view is, you're to have no joy whatsoever. When Jewish people do something, they do it in full. So, a person dies, it's a time to mourn. Everything is done to accentuate that mourning. So, the idea of having something sweet-smelling, the flowers which are pretty and beautiful, is a no-no from a Jewish point of view. Again, if the family is not real religious, or if there are friends or relatives in the family who come who don't know about Jewish customs, they might send flowers, which would be a very Gentile/Christian thing to do, but it would be, if they're observant, it would be an affront. So I'm often asked, well, what should you give, or how should you express your feelings when you can't do something like that? Well, there's a couple of ideas. Number one, you can send some sort of fruit basket, food to help feed those who are mourning during that time. Also, another really good one is to plant a tree in Israel in the person's name. Again, the idea we emphasize, Judaism celebrates life. So when somebody passes away, if you plant a tree, a little seedling tree that's going to grow up to be a big tree in that person's name in Israel, that's a wonderful, thoughtful gift. Certainly another thing is, oftentimes the family might say, if you're thinking of doing anything, maybe the person died of a specific disease and there's research, giving in that person's name for that particular issue would be a good thing. The idea is to stay away from, the Jewish mourner has to stay away from music, from flowers, from anything that has great happiness or joy. So casket, simple wooden box, no metal, and they use wooden pegs. No cremation, by the way. I've gotten into some interesting discussions with Christians about the whole concept of cremation. In the Old Testament, cremation, by that I mean fire on the body, was always associated with judgment. You might remember when Saul was killed. Do you remember he was beheaded? But the body was then taken off the wall and buried. Again, this respect for the body, burying the body, dust to dust. So there is, in Judaism, a number of less observant Jewish people are doing more and more cremation, and the reason is very simple. It's an economic reason. Christianity, it's the same thing. Anybody at their church or in your own family decided on cremation instead of burial? Have you encountered that? Okay, several. If we would have had this class 20 years ago, probably no hand would go up. It was an affront to think that way. But that's changing in the Jewish community, as not by the observant Jewish people, but by less observant people. And it's changing even in the Christian community. Any questions at all? Okay. 3 stages of mourning. There actually are stages to go through. And I would argue that these are effective to help a person go through that whole process. First is the Shiva. The Shiva is 7 days. The Shiva is to be a time where if a Jewish men who are left behind, their loved one died, and you're a male, you won't shave. Unless, of course, you have a beard, you wouldn't shave anyway. But the idea of shaving, not done. Wearing leather shoes, not done. You wear sneakers. Covering up mirrors. The idea is to humble yourself, to be as humble as you can be. So when people come to your home for a condolence call to pay their respects, you'll sit for 7 days on stools with no backs that are lower than every chair in the house. So what will happen is the immediate family, husband or wife, children, will sit on chairs very low, and the people come to visit. They're towering over the people they're visiting. And the idea is to create an atmosphere where there is humbleness, just lowliness. It's a bad time, intense time. When people come, the idea is to talk about that person. Crying is encouraged. People just don't come up and say, okay, come on, have a good cry. But the idea of getting the person to talk about their loved one, all the emotion that goes into that is something encouraged within Judaism, because we love life. We love to live. That person loved life and had a rich life and whatever, and now it's over. And that's a sad thing. And so for 7 days, Shiva takes place. Shaloshim is 30. This will be a less intense mourning, but nonetheless a mourning. So during the 7 days, you're not allowed to listen to music. If you're Orthodox and like to read the Bible, the only passages you can read from would be from Lamentations, appropriate, very sad thing to read. So only things that will just emphasize sadness. Shaloshim, you're allowed a little bit more. You could go back to work. 7 days, you can't work. You're at home during that whole time. But now for these next 30 days, you will go back to work, get back into the swing of things, etc. Then is the Avelut is actually a year. I just have mourning here, but it's a year period of time. So the total period of mourning is going to be 1 year. And the rabbis say at the end of that 1 year, and we'll talk about what they do on that anniversary of death, but after that 1 year period is over, no more tears. Now, they can't legislate that, but the purpose of it is to say, look, your life will have to go on. We acknowledge that there should be mourning, that you're going to miss the person, that you're feeling bad, that you could be depressed. And so that's why they want to encourage you to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But Judaism, traditional Judaism, teaches that you do so much of that until you come to the point in your life where you move on. And from a psychological point of view, there's a lot to be said about that. Rather than keeping it all in, keeping a stiff upper lip, not letting anybody know you're emotional. Yes, you're, from a Christian point of view, yes, I know that person is in heaven and I'm happy. When in reality, yes, they're in heaven, but you're sad. There is sadness in death. not for the person, now speaking from a Christian point of view, but for the people left behind. There's sadness. And so there's a struggle, at least I've sensed a few times within Christianity. Yes, you want to have an upbeat celebration of a person's life, but the fact is people deal with it. Spouses have to deal with their loss. Children deal with the loss of their parents. Parents dealing with the loss of their children. Those are rough, difficult things. So, talking a little bit about Shiva, the last 7 days, it is observed by father, mother, children. Mother, daughter, son, brother, sister. Those would be the people sitting Shiva. That's what it's actually called. You sit for 7 days. Shiva's 7. So, sitting for 7 days. We already talked about sitting lower, sitting on the seats with no backs, abstaining from all pleasures, no leather shoes, men don't shave. We talked about this. Korea. The idea of cutting. In the Bible, you might remember whenever there was outrage in the Scripture, do you remember what they would do when a prophet was outraged, when a person, what would they do? Rip their garments, tear their garments, sometimes throw ashes upon themselves as well. The ripping of the garments was an expression biblically of great mourning. It comes to my mind in the book of Esther when Mordecai found out that there was a decree to kill his people, and his cousin, is Queen Esther. When he found out about that decree, he ripped his garment. And there are other instances in the Scriptures that talk about that. It's a great sign of just great horror, mourning. When the funeral takes place, the father, mother, sister, brother, children of that deceased person stand at the beginning of the service. The rabbi comes. If you're female, they usually give you a black scarf. In the old days, they would actually cut your garment, but to save, things are expensive, they put a black scarf around your neck, and you will actually hear the rabbi. They're designed to make noise when you rip them. So imagine at a funeral, it's very quiet and somber. At the very beginning, the family is seated separately from everybody else. The rabbi comes, and you can hear. Then he'll come to the men who might be there, and they have a jacket, usually a coat jacket. They'll do one of two things. They'll either cut the lapel in reality, and then that person obviously doesn't use that coat again, or they'll place a little ribbon on the lapel, again, made of material that makes noise, and the rabbi will rip the garment. The idea is when that happens, oftentimes, other people in the audience, when they hear that, begin to weep because they know what it means. It's like the beginning. Person's been dead already for a day, and they know that, but when they hear that, it's like it happened all over again. So it's a very emotional thing. So they cut the garment. During the 30 days, so it lasts 23 days, total of a month, mourners aren't allowed to listen to music. You don't go to weddings. Again, this is an Orthodox setting. So if a loved one dies and there's a relative who's getting married and you're part of the immediate family, according to the law, you're not allowed to go. Doesn't mean Jewish people don't break that law. Some do. But according to the law, you're not supposed to do that. And then for the year anniversary of the death, it's now 1 year. The idea is to go back to the cemetery. It's now 1 year later. You go back to the cemetery, and on the stone marker will be a covering. The material will look like a cheesecloth kind of thing. It's a netting over the stone. And in fact, that netting sits there, once the stone is actually placed in. So the family buys, they have their plot, the person is buried, they now have a stone, but they place a covering. So if anybody's walking around the cemetery to visit a grave site and they see that, they know that that person has died less than a year ago. That sits there for a period of time. The year anniversary of the person's death, it's almost like reenacting the funeral again. So everybody, loved ones go back to the cemetery, stand over the grave with the marker, and the service is performed where the netting or covering is removed. This is the final, not goodbye, because people certainly go back and visit the grave, but it is the final act that you're required to do religiously. A prayer is recited. Now it's in your books, those of you who have the books. I can't remember if it's in volume, I think it's in volume 1, the blue one. But the Kaddish. The Kaddish is a prayer not for the dead, as many Jewish people think, and some Gentiles as well. It is actually a praise to God, but it's recited at the time of the funeral, it's recited at the year anniversary, and then thereupon every anniversary later, it is required for the family to recite this prayer. In English, if you can see it, it says, "Glorified and sanctified be God's great name throughout the world, which He has created. According to His will, may He establish His kingdom in your lifetime and during your days, and within the life of the entire house of Israel, speedily and soon, and say amen. May His great name be blessed forever and all eternity." And it goes on similar to that. The idea is that this prayer doesn't even mention the person's name, yet it is recited as a memorial. And what's the memorial? The memorial really, technically, is praising God's name for who He is. I cannot tell you that when people recite this, that they are thinking in terms of praising God's name. They might or might not know the translation. It's recited in Hebrew, sometimes it's transliterated, sometimes it's just in English, and they can say it. But I can tell you that Kaddish is associated with remembering that person. So reciting Kaddish is important. I'll give you how important in a personal story. When I became a believer in Jesus Christ, the first thing my father told me that made him so upset was the idea that once he passed away, that I would not say Kaddish for him. Now remember, Kaddish doesn't mention the person's name. However, that prayer is known throughout Judaism, whether you're very observant or not, as an identifying feature of Judaism. And so, the concept of saying this prayer for your loved one is a sign of great respect and honor, to pay an honor to your loved one. The thought while you're alive that your loved one is moving away from that kind of tradition is a very difficult thing to fathom. Now, my response to my father was, look, I will say it if you want me to say it, but what's more important to me is praying for you while you are alive. The difference between Jewish thought and Christian thought. So, when my father passed away, it was a Jewish funeral. We were at the funeral home, and when it came time to rip the garment, I had the thing, and when it was time to say Kaddish, I said Kaddish. But that's not for my dad. I don't mind saying it's for him, but he's dead. It was for my family, those that especially didn't know the Lord, which I have several of them, the idea is, look, this is important. Debating and discussing the pros and cons of these kinds of things in that context, that's not the place. Although some Christians do use those places as their opportunities to stand firm. I confess, on tape even, I didn't do that and wouldn't do it. That it's important to respect your family, to be a witness, and to, as long as it doesn't compromise your faith in any way, and certainly there's nothing bad about this prayer at all. Question. Loud.
Wouldn't that sort of be like a form of joyfulness if you're giving praise to God?
The question is, isn't that a form of joyfulness if you're giving praise to God? The answer to that is the words are joyful. They're honoring and glorifying to God. The context of saying this prayer, this is the only time this prayer is used. It's always used in reference to a deceased loved one. Therefore, the words praise God, they certainly do, but they are never uttered with a smile on your face, because the association of the prayer is always associated with the death of the person, even if their name isn't used. So it's a contextual kind of thing. You're right. If you look at the words, you say, well, man, this is God's the one in charge. His name should be praised, glorified. Absolutely true. But when it's time to say it, and they always say it with a minyan, you need 10 men in order to say a corporate prayer of Kaddish. And people rise in a corporate setting, like at a holiday, a Shabbat, or at a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur service at the synagogue. There's a period of time where they have corporate Kaddish, but only if it applies to you. So when I was real young, going to synagogue with my dad, my grandmother had passed away. So I didn't have to stand up when it came time to Kaddish. So I was seated because my father and mother were alive, but my father had to get up and say it. So there's an awareness. For those that go to the synagogue, there's a keen awareness. When that prayer goes on, everybody who stands, you look around a whole congregation, and the people that are standing have lost close relatives and are saying this prayer. That has an effect on the people who are still seated. You're watching, in your situation, you're seated, you're communicating to people. So far, it hasn't hit home for me. It might be a distant relative, but if you're seated, your mother and father are alive, your brothers and sisters are alive, so it hasn't hit you yet. If you're standing up, it means it has. That has a psychological effect, and again, life is so cherished within Judaism that when it's snuffed out, no matter how old the person is, it is a real loss. At the year anniversary, a Yortzeit candle is lit. There are some traditions, other traditions that light candles in honor of the deceased person. At the year anniversary, the Yortzeit candle is a 24-hour candle. It is the funeral home will send a reminder to the immediate family that, and that's part of the deal when you have the funeral at a particular home. You give their name and address, or now they email it to you, I'm sure, and they let you know that the anniversary is coming up. You got to get one of these candles, and you can buy them in cities where there's large Jewish populations. You can buy them almost anywhere. They'll have them, and you light the candle in the person's, and say Kaddish for that person. Let me, before we, if you ever get to Israel, or if you've ever been, for whatever reason, at a Jewish cemetery, as you walk around, you might see stones at the gravesite. Sometimes lots of stones. In order to communicate to other people that that person has been visited, they place a stone at the gravesite. So if you're walking in a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery, you'll see stones all over. Some people don't have any stones. That's sometimes a sad thing, because that means nobody has recently visited the gravesite. Other places have several stones, which means that the person has been visited. There's again, a difference of thinking and culture. Is there anybody here whose family ever went to the gravesite on a regular basis of some loved one who's died that you know of? Anybody? It's usually the case amongst Bible-believing Christians. Not that they don't go, but they don't go nearly as often to a gravesite as a Jewish person would go to. And there's a reason for that. Believers believe that that's the body. It's important, but that's not where the person is. We don't believe the person's there. And so the need to go to the gravesite is much less. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's much less. On the other hand, in my experience growing up, when my grandparents passed away, my parents went on a regular basis. That is, there were certain dates, certain holidays, Jewish holidays that they might go, but for sure they would go at least once a year on the anniversary of their death. It's not that anybody else knows about it, it's just the tradition, the idea of respect that we're to have biblically. Honor your father and your mother, so it's honoring to go visit the gravesite. Christian thinking is a little bit different, since we realize there'll be a reunion in heaven, and that the body is going back to dust. Changing gears a little. Kosher. Anybody know what kosher is? You ever hear that word? What do we know about kosher? Guesses? You ever hear it before? You know, it has actually become part of the English language. I've heard it used on the streets of cities in America, not by Jewish people. You might hear in business, is that kosher? Are you allowed to do that? Is how it's used. The word kosher actually means fit or proper. You could have kosher clothes. For those of you familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, you know that the idea of mixing up cloth was not forbidden. It was forbidden. That is, you're not allowed to take two different kinds of cloth and sew them together. So you can have unfit clothing. You could have unfit food. You can have unfit business practices. You can have unfit all kinds of things, as well as fit things, proper things. In reference to food, you'll see the U, and this, of course, says in Hebrew kosher. Little piggies, not allowed. You look in the scripture, and we know what you're allowed to eat and what you're not allowed to eat, even how you're allowed to kill what you're allowed to eat. In other words, if you had a cow, which is a kosher animal, but killed it improperly, it is now unkosher. And we'll talk about that in a second. So I already talked about business, a religion, there could be kosher things. Families, that's kosher, that's not kosher. Kosher relationships, non-kosher relationships. But in Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy, it outlines the foods that we're allowed to have. Mammals must have split hoofs and chew their cuds. So a little piggy has cleft feet, has a split hoof, but it doesn't chew its cud. Not kosher. But I'll let you in on a little secret. If you want to find a Jewish neighborhood, this is unscientific but fairly accurate, the way to find a Jewish neighborhood is to look for Chinese restaurants. Jewish people, historically, love Chinese restaurants. And by the way, not much of Chinese food is kosher. It can be. In Israel, they have a number of kosher Chinese restaurants. But in America, I've never encountered a kosher Chinese restaurant because sweet and sour pork, sweet and sour shrimp, all those kinds of things. Was there a question? Did I see? Okay. The fish must have scales and fins. Okay? So if you like lobster or crab or mussels, no. All unkosher. Catfish, if you like catfish, unkosher. And the Bible clearly states what is and what is not kosher. Birds, duck, chicken, but birds are kosher, but birds of prey are not. So fried heron or roast eagle or sweet and sour owl, can't have it. They're not kosher. Insects are forbidden as well. Now, there's 3 classifications. In Yiddish, Fleischig is meat. Okay? Milchig is dairy. And the Bible tells us, and parv, by the way, is neutral. So there are certain things that are dairy, certain things that are meat, and those have to be separate, and certain things that you could eat with either meat or dairy. Exodus 23 and verse 19 reads this way: "You shall not boil a kid in his mother's milk." It is that verse that rabbis have said the mixing of milk and meat is prohibited. Thus, in a kosher home, you'll not have cheeseburgers. Won't happen. Can't have a cheeseburger. You won't have, those of you who maybe you've been to McDonald's or some other fast food place, and you've gotten a hamburger and a milkshake. It's not going to happen. Can't happen in a kosher Jewish home. In fact, keeping those two separate becomes a major deal. Question?
Maybe you're going to answer this later, but why did the Lord say, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk?
The question is, why did the Lord say, don't do this? Boiling a kid in its mother's milk. Any guesses? Or maybe you know. What do you think God was trying to do in this instance? Which I would argue he was doing with the food in general. Yes?
Wasn't that a practice of the nations surrounding Israel or something like that?
The statement was, wasn't that a practice of surrounding nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles? That's exactly right. One of the delicacies of that period of time was taking a young kid and fixing it in the mother's at the time. It was a delicacy. If I were to try to find an analogy for today, although it's not, but it makes some people very upset. Any of you ever eat veal? Okay? Some of you say no. Do you have a conviction against eating veal? Some people do. And the reason is veal is a young cow that has been probably tied up or kept in a cage, and for its whole life before it's butchered stays there so that it won't develop any strong muscles. And so some people, although veal is a kosher food, I'm talking people in general, Jewish, Gentile, they won't eat veal. Well, in thinking in terms of boiling a kid in its mother's milk, the idea is God called Jewish people to be separate, not to live like the Gentiles. So, the interpretation, as I look at the context, although I have nothing against not mixing milk with meat. For instance, I was raised in a kosher home for a number of years. The idea of eating a hamburger with a milkshake makes me, I can't take it. But that's just because of the way I was raised. But the concept of putting meat and then throwing dairy on top of it in the stomach is just not a good thing. And by the way, you can find medical doctors who will say, It's a good thing not to do that. It's a very good thing, because one is harder on your system than the other, and the digestive process, well, issues arise. And so another thing is that, now we have dishwashers today, but when I was growing up, most observant Jews had double sinks. The reason, when you did dishes for dairy, you put them on one side. When you had dishes for meat, you put them on another. So the question is, well, wait a minute. You wash the sink out, and if you're not allowed to put them together, what difference does it make? There are Orthodox Jewish people are so observant. The idea of washing, even with hot water, there are some Jewish people who will have 2 dishwashers, the one for dairy and the one for meat, even though you can press the button for sanitizing cycle, burn everything away. Now, it depends on the person. I'm just saying that depending on how observant they are, they will carry that thought all the way through. So there's no cheeseburgers, no milkshakes, separate dishes and utensils. From a practical point of view, for a person who is going to decide, I am going to live an observant Jewish life, it's expensive to do so. Your food's going to be more expensive. Let me give you an example. When I was in high school, I worked for a kosher butcher. If you compare the price of kosher meat versus store-bought meat, the difference is significant. It could be 25, 30% more. But here's what sometimes happens. Let's say the kosher place, they buy a cow, they slaughter the cow, they inspect the cow, which they have to do. We'll be talking about that. They inspect the cow, and they find that there was a spot on the lung, just a spot. Or the kidney had an imperfection, some sort of issue. Didn't affect the meat. The meat is not rancid in any way. But as the rabbis looked at it to inspect it, they found a problem internally with the animal that has been koshered. And we'll talk about that shortly. What do they do with it? They don't sell it in a kosher shop. They will sell that animal to Gentiles. So, not saying, look, we probably have eaten meat from an animal that might have had an imperfection, and we're fine for it. So, but think about it. The process of kosher is that every animal is first inspected as to how it's killed, then it's inspected when it's opened up, and if it's found less than what it should be, it's rejected. So that's why you end up paying more. Question?
Could I go into a kosher butcher shop and buy some meat?
The question is, can I buy kosher meat? We're in America. Absolutely. In fact, when I was in high school, a long time ago, half the people on my route of delivering food to were Gentile people. And the reason I remember asking them, why am I delivering kosher meat to, I had some Hispanic people, some African Americans, and other Gentiles, and they said, this is the best stuff. We only want good stuff, and so that would be the reason. Yes, if you have the money, you could certainly purchase. They're not asking if you're Jewish or not Jewish. And in fact, as I said, some people do it because they know that it's a better quality. So we talked about the double sink. If you're going to mix meat with milk, the only religious way you can do it is to wait 6 hours. It is believed that the body takes that long to, especially the meat part. If you eat meat, you got to wait 6 hours for dairy. So you won't find observant Jewish families having ice cream after their steak meal. So when you go to Israel, and we take a number of people, Friends of Israel takes a number of people to Israel. When they go there and they have meat, what do you do if you want cream in your coffee? Well, in Israel, you won't get cream in your coffee, but today we have substitutes. dairy substitutes. So for instance, if you're Orthodox, you say, I would like to know what it's like to have a cheeseburger. Today's society, you don't have to really go too far off. You go to a section in the store where they might have fake cheese, tofu cheese or vegetable, vegan-style cheese. So it's not really cheese, but it looks like it, close to the consistency. Well, you could slap vegan cheese on a hamburger, and it'd be perfectly kosher because the substance is not dairy. You want to put white stuff in your coffee. Can't use half and half, but they do have substitutes for that. And you can, again, it's not the same thing, but it's close. Okay, the shoket is the person that slaughters the animal. Slaughtering the animal in Judaism, respect for the animal, believe it or not, respect for the animal is important. So while some slaughterhouses run the animals through a conveyor belt where a machine takes a spike into the head of the animal, down it drops, and stuff happens fast, sometimes when the animal is alive. It shouldn't be, but that sometimes happens. It won't happen in a Jewish context. Why? Because the shoket has a very sharp blade, one stroke to the jugular, and the animal is killed instantly. And then that animal needs to bleed. So I have up there, there's no roadkill allowed. The idea of hitting a deer, which by the way would be kosher, technically, it is, but it's dead, it's hurt, you wouldn't be allowed, if you keep kosher, you wouldn't be allowed to eat that animal. If the animal died a natural death rather than being butchered, even if the meat would be considered okay and pass every standard, it wouldn't pass the Jewish standard. I think I mentioned, if you've ever seen the commercials for Hebrew National, they always say, we answer to a higher authority. And so that's an important concept. One swift cut to the trachea, and that animal drops down and is dead. The blade itself must be kosher. The blade. The blade is inspected by the rabbi. In order to have a butcher shop, for instance, it has to be certified by a rabbi. Otherwise, those who are very observant won't buy from you. It has to be certified. And so the knives themselves have to be inspected. If there is a nick on the knife, and they know that they've killed this many animals, they would all be considered unkosher, because by having that nick, the cut isn't clean, and the animal might have suffered. It wasn't butchered the correct way, and that law must be followed. All the internal organs are inspected. All the blood must be drained. In Leviticus, I would argue a very important verse for a number of different reasons. Leviticus 17:11 says, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Oh, that's, without blood, no life. The life of the flesh is in the blood. And I've given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes an atonement. So that's interesting. In Leviticus, the Torah, 17:11, it says, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Therefore, we must get rid of the blood. We're not allowed to eat animals with blood in them because that's considered life. We eat dead animals, not life animals that are alive. And so the concept of it's important to kosher an animal. Not only is it drained, when the purchaser gets the meat, they take it home and they pack it in salt. The salt will drive out or squeeze out the rest of the blood. So, any of you ever have blood sausage? Okay, I'm in Iowa. Oh, okay. Usually hands go up. Well, that would be a no-no for Jewish people. Sausage, certainly because it's pork, but the idea of blood is just an affront to them. Rabbi. In Judaism, the rabbi is the teacher. Some of you come from experiences where your churches, meetings have elders. Some of you have pastors. An elder or a pastor would be a teacher of the word. That would certainly be one of their gifts. A rabbi as well. The idea of teacher. In the New Testament, Jesus is called rabbi, teacher. Highly respected, very important. In the old days, a rabbi was a teacher because of his great knowledge, love for the word, but he probably did something else. The rabbi might be, in the old days, a tailor or a butcher or something else. But because of his great ability, that person who was making his living as something else was called by the congregation their rabbi because he had wisdom, he knew the word, he knew the traditions, he had an answer. And again, for those of you who've seen Fiddler on the Roof, probably one of the funniest lines, Rabbi, Rabbi, do you have a prayer for the czar? If you've ever heard that, the rabbi stops for a moment and then says, yes, Lord, keep the czar far away from us. And so he's wise and he's able to answer the question by providing a prayer, but important enough that it affects in a positive way the people. A cantor, and we'll stop with this and take a break. The cantor in Hebrew is called the chazan, and a chazan or cantor is trained to recite the liturgy in song, in a cappella, going up, going down, reciting the various prayers in a sing-song kind of way. Cantors usually have good voices, they've been trained, so very important part of the synagogue experience.